So this is the next phase in the work that we're doing in the Teanaway Forks. I showed you the very top of the West Fork on the state land. We have another project underway just downstream from that. But the design for that is funded and it's not yet ready to request implementation funding. So what we're requesting here is preliminary design funding for the third phase of the restoration work in the west of the Middle Fork Teanaway. And again, this is a partnership project with Yakima Nation, Mid-Columbia, DFW, DNR, and the Forest Service. So there's a novel partnership on this one that I'll explain as we proceed. Still in the same part of the watershed. But now we're moving to the upper part of the Middle Fork Teanaway on the state land and on a little segment of national forest. On this map, I should have explained before, these are little pockets of private land. Everything in the beige is community forest, and then the green is the national forest. So we had two project reaches here. We were looking at river mile 3.2 to 5.4, and then we were looking above that from 5.4 to 7.4. But we've decided to look at the full length of reach together when coming up with our preliminary design. It's pretty likely that when we go to implementation, that'll be split. This is a very long project reach. I haven't ever tried to do implementation on something this long in one phase, but it makes sense to have our design be unified and coordinated as we move forward. So again, we're looking at steelhead, and we have less steelhead use in this part of the Middle Fork, at least from 2012 to 2014. And I think when you see the pictures, you can see some of the barriers to why they may not be making their way up there and why they might be having a hard time finding spawning material. Oh, sorry, one more thing to point out is that the Middle Fork is critical habitat for bull trout, but bull trout are extirpated here as they are in the full Teanaway watershed. So limiting factors for the watershed remain the same, but we see much greater expanses of this incision down to bedrock in the Middle Fork Teanaway River. You knew the percentage before. Do you know this one?
I think,
no, I don't know it either. William Meyer with DFW had a crew map the area of exposed bedrock in the Teanaway Forks, which is really sobering and helpful information for targeting restoration. So this area is near the downstream extent of the project reach, around river mile 3.2, just above the private land. And these were the flow conditions last September. Certainly not passable. I should never say that because Alice will call me anytime I say certainly. Appears to be impassable to fall spawners for sure under these conditions. And we can imagine that conditions for passage are better in the spring when steelhead are moving in, but the habitat available here is simply lacking for rearing. So I would expect that fish are moving to more hospitable places. Yeah.
I would call it a food desert too,
Okay.
for juveniles. It's,
Yeah.
it's not producing food for them in terms of
Or cover.
bugs.
So the work that we're proposing is to complete preliminary design of restoration to primarily reverse channel incision, reconnect the floodplains, and improve the availability of in-stream habitat for steelhead in this reach. We are partnering with the Forest Service, and they have an in-house consulting team called an enterprise team that specializes in a restoration technique known as stage 0. And they're focusing on this long reach to identify where within the reach the stage 0 technique or some of its related techniques could meet our project objectives. They are not engineers. We have fish biologists and hydrologists on that team. But a lot of this project reach is within regulatory floodplain, and it's going to require stamped hydraulic modeling and a letter of map revision to FEMA to indicate that we will be changing the way floods happen through this area. Even though it's on state community forest, it's still covered by that regulation. So our request,
significant development immediately downstream.
and there is, yeah. So our request to Surf Board is to fill in the gaps of what the Forest Service Enterprise team can't do for us on this Project Reach. And that's having a professional engineer do the hydraulic modeling and prepare the letter of map revision and offer design assistance from an engineering perspective. It's also to support Mid-Columbia Fisheries' time to coordinate the project and to perform extensive public and landowner outreach because of the concerns that we are right above private land. And then to prepare a planting plan. We have our restoration ecologist, Kat Strathman, would be engaged in doing that planning. So now I'm just gonna give you a tour. I don't have aerial footage of this reach yet. So we're gonna be doing a river-based view of what things look like from the downstream extent of the reach upstream to the National Forest boundary. So we're starting again near River Mile 3.2 last September. I was with Mike Bosco and Zach Zakovich, taking a look at how conditions are at low flow. Then we move up, we did an assessment of this area in 2012. So moving upstream, this was August of 2012, about a mile upstream from that other area. We do have cobbles and some larger gravels here, and we do not have very much water in this portion. They targeted areas where wood had already started to do some work there and then looked at how they could help the wood to do more work. So we have pictures of the pieces of wood that had been recruited to the Middle Fork Teanaway in 2012. And then looking at how even just this limited amount of complexity starts to do the work we want to see. By which I mean, we've got accumulations of fine sediment behind the wood from the flow. And there seems to be a bit of a pool scoured there. And that is a really valuable thing in a reach that's otherwise dominated by large boulders. Challenging place for young fish. We're up at River Mile 5.1 here.
That's getting into the canyon, right?
Not quite, we haven't crossed the bridge yet.
Okay.
So this is just before we cross the bridge over the Middle Fork, and this is an example of the redundant roads that we see in places. This is the primary road, the Middle Fork Teanaway Road. This is the old road to nowhere. And the road has been closed, but it's still acting as a giant levee, along with some riprap on the edges. Now we're moving into the canyon. It's beautiful, gorgeous place. Deep pools, lots of bedrock in the ways that are there naturally. I would say not as a result of past land management here.
Informal hook and line sampling says lots of them, Mike.
Yeah, gorgeous place. Then at River Mile 5.6, there's a boulder falls. This is about a 9-foot drop that we think is probably acting as a barrier to upstream passage in most situations. Part of the project will be to take a look to see, is that because we don't have any wood in this area? If we had wood structures above and below, would we see this as something that was passable? Moving above that area, we see large boulders dominating the stream bed. I mean, like these seem already large, and then that's very large. And then we get into an open area where there's some potential for re-establishing floodplain connection. There's a wetland area that's completely bisected by the trail that goes along the Middle Fork Teanaway River. And part of the conceptual design for this area is to look at relocating that trail and allowing this wetland to be restored. And then finally at the top, we have our friend, the scoured down to bedrock stream bed condition. And we have a berm. So I looked at these, I had my daughter take these pictures while I stood in the river to try for scale, and I thought she doesn't focus on the same things I would. So you can't actually see me in here, but just know that the bank is much taller than I am. And we have exposed bedrock in this area. Okay, so that's a sampling of the reach. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that phrase stage zero, because it's a very specific restoration technique, with kind of a catchy name and a lot of buzz right now. The word comes from this model of stream evolution. And the idea is that if you think of a landslide as being the ultimate reset for a river, so everything in the valley has filled up because there's been a giant debris flow, and then the water has to start carving its own way through. That's what's considered stage zero for stream channel evolution. And if an event like that occurs, then first we'd see water moving through with a good amount of energy forming a path. And over time, trees would play a huge element in shaping the way the channel evolved. We'd see things widening and then building up again and then widening, and the creek would move back and forth and be dynamic. But what the authors of this model point out is that there are a couple of places where creeks can get stuck and stop evolving. And one is if they are channelized with levees. Well, we know that's happened in many places in the Teanaway. The other is if they incise down to a level of the bed that is resistant to scour. Well, that's also happened in the Teanaway. That sandstone bedrock does further erode, but it erodes more slowly than an area that would be dominated by gravels or fines. So we think that in the channels we're working in, several areas there are sort of stuck and they're not evolving in the way that river systems might otherwise evolve. And the restoration technique that the Forest Service team has really publicized is to actively reset a channel to stage zero. So this is a series of photos from Wycus Creek. Is that how you pronounce that? Is it in there? Looks like Wycus.
White shoes.
Okay, that creek in Oregon, where the creek had been moved out of its floodplain, put into a single thread channel and kept out of the way of a pasture. So this is what is shown in the 2015 photo. The restoration technique here was to fill the existing channel, have the full floodplain area be filled up with a matrix of wood, and then to have the water come through and form new pathways through. So immediately post-implementation, we're seeing water flowing through many, many channels being shaped by the wood. 3 years later, the more stable vegetation has started to establish, and we're beginning to see multiple thread channel with shade vegetation over each thread. And then 6 years later, the trees have begun to mature, and there's a wide, productive valley with water in multiple places. Questions or thoughts about this approach? I think what's interesting about it is that a lot of the work that we look at now uses elements of this. But just 10 years ago, that thought of actively taking fill material and putting it into the creek was a big deal and was hard for us to talk about with our permitters. So I think there's been an increased acceptance that to reverse some really serious land management impacts on the ground, we need to be pretty aggressive in places to try and get the creek to be functional in a way that it might have been otherwise.
Just a comment from a sometimes permitter is the situation you have in this reach is one in which there's a lot less risk because there's not much there. So it is probably a pretty appropriate place to try something new to the Yakima Basin.
Our area, yeah. Most of this work has happened in Oregon. I think there have been 1 or 2 projects in Washington.
This model is really built around the idea of depositional floodplain areas. It's not a fits-all places, so even within a reach, it's where does it best fit your goals? You can fill a creek, and in many cases, you can fill it in, and 10 years later, have a channel not that dissimilar from what you filled. That's probably not the same as when you think that you actually get a steady state braided and anastomosing stream channel across an alluvial area. And it just means placing it in the right places.
That was a very nice segue. So we just have some concepts right now for the work that would be done, and at the upstream portion of the reach, the part that has the trail moving around it, there are areas of artificial fill, the old railroad berms, the trail fill in some locations, some old roads. And there are targeted locations where that fill could be placed back in the river along with wood to meet some site-specific objectives for reconnection. This is showing the area where I tried to get my daughter to take a picture of me in the creek. So again, we see there's a berm here that I do not know the purpose of anymore. And there's a trail bisecting a wetland floodplain. And this would be an area where we could remove that berm material from the floodplain, use it to help the creek be raised in elevation, and we would meet multiple objectives there. But as we move downstream, we start to look at the length of creek that is a better fit for the stage 0 restoration model. And the stage 0 team looks at the relative elevations of the stream bed to the areas alongside it, and gets an idea of how far they are from each other, basically. And then they take an average slope from the top of the valley to the downstream extent of the valley. And they say, okay, if past land management hadn't changed the elevations in here, what would we expect to see as the average elevation along this slope? And then their plan is generally a grading plan that says, here's what we would do to meet that average slope all the way through the lake. Which is what's shown here. There's a trend line that would be the expected average slope. And then in places where the elevations are lower than that trend line or higher than that trend line, that would indicate to them that those would be cut or fill locations along the lake. And it produces really pretty pictures with lots of colors, but basically what it's indicating is, here we have the lowest portions. You can see where the channel is cut down considerably lower than its adjacent historic floodplain. And here's areas that are raised really high relative to the rest of the floodplain, where fill could be borrowed and returned to the channel. So again, this is not identical to the last slide, but it's pretty similar. This restoration technique will allow us to address the limiting factors that we see in the Teanaway watershed and in this reach specifically. I guess one difference here is that we wouldn't be placing wood, at least in the stage 0 approach. We would be creating a whole matrix of wood throughout the floodplain that then would be sorted and moved around. Similar alignment with the recovery plan with the tag focus action. Similar alignment with the citizen committee priorities. But different challenges. So Alex mentioned that there is significant infrastructure downstream from the region. This is the infrastructure. There are multiple, I think maybe about 30 residences on the private land downstream from the project reach. So a key design consideration and constraint is absolutely protection of those structures and of the private property downstream. And the stage 0 team has already mocked up their concepts with that in mind, with the indication that they'll be reducing the energy of the river upstream. We should see decreased flood damage to these downstream landowners, and there'll be an extra level of protection as we move to the downstream part of our restoration reach. If anybody looked a little skeptical there, I think that's how the landowners and the public are going to feel as well. So extensive public outreach is scoped into our request to serve board. And that includes field trips, public meetings at the Teanaway Grange, and then Mid-Columbia staff who will go out on weekends throughout the summer of 2025 and talk with people who are using the river, explain what the project plans include, get a sense of their concerns, and then be able to respond directly to those concerns. And finally, the FEMA map revision process is new to Mid-Columbia Fisheries. We will work with engineers for whom it's not new, but to me it's daunting, and so I put it down as a challenge. We're requesting $256,500, and we have a commitment of $244,300 in match, primarily from the Forest Service for their time to do the conceptual design, and then also from the Yakima Nation for their partnership on the project. This work would hit the ground 2027 to 2028. So we're at the right stage for beginning our design at this point. Conceptual design is included in a previous surfboard grant. And so we would complete conceptual design to meet that deliverable before this grant work was contracted in September. And then we're already beginning our public outreach. I think Tom and I have a repeat performance in May.
I better put that on my calendar.
Yeah,
To do it by yourself.
to bring people out to look at the bedrock and explain how it impacts fish. And then we'll be tackling the permitting and the preliminary design. Oh, these are just more stage 0 pictures if people are interested, but I can take questions at this point.
Not exactly a question, but I was just prowling around here and couldn't help but notice that where you enter the canyon, that's the contact between the Roslyn Formation and the Teanaway Salt, which explains why there's a canyon there. And then when you hook into that open area up above, that's where you get out of the Teanaway and into the Swat Formation, which is a sandstone quite a bit more like the Roslyn. So you geomorphic folks might want to just look at what stage 0 looks like for stream through a basalt flow as opposed to stream through
Yeah,
more erodible sandstone.
and my suspicion is that basalt reach is not a place where we would do stage 0, but there might be targeted wood placement to meet some specific objectives in there. But we'll see where they go with it. But it's nice when the geology lines up with what the pictures show.
I didn't know that until just now. So.
Yeah.
This might be a tough question. I'm gonna put you on the spot. So you showed us what looks like a real fish barrier there halfway through the project. This is a surfboard. We're funding stuff where, you know, our target species can get to, which is probably the lower half of the project up to that barrier. The idea that you could add some wood and create accessibility seems optimistic, me at least, without knowing more. Maybe there's more I should know before, you know, reaching that preliminary conclusion. So if you can't create good passage there, why should Surfboard fund the upper part of the project?
So I think that it's appropriate to be funding preliminary design and alternatives assessment at this stage, which will allow us to look at that and say, is it feasible for there to be passage? Would it even make sense for there to be passage? I think that would be a question. I probably wouldn't bring this to Surfboard for implementation if we were trying to do the work above a passage barrier. Not even probably, we just wouldn't. But it is worthwhile to look at this long reach together while we have the support of the enterprise team to do so. And so I'm excited to get their eyes on it and their work on the ground.
So it would essentially match their scope.
Yeah.
That they've already got.
There's also real potential for wetland restoration upstream, which has downstream benefits. And those will be benefits to fish.
Becca, would dynamite be out of the question for that boulder drop?
No, not out of the question. I've never done that either. So that'd be map revisions and dynamite in one time.
All right.
You have a drone, right?
Sure.
Yeah. No, but people do that.
It's just, could you with that create
Yeah.
passage?
Yes, with enough dynamite.
Well,
Yeah.
this is,
And is there enough water?
this is a steep enough canyon with enough rock that the question would be, after your next flood, would you need more dynamite?
Who comes back?
And more time.
Or with the explosion of dynamite and more rock.
Suddenly it's stage
Percussion.
0 without the intent.
There you go,
Stage zero.
a really cheap stage.
Yeah.
There's a solution.
Other thoughts or questions? Just show you this, this is what it looks like when the Forest Service modifies. So this was their preliminary, or not preliminary, their very conceptual design for a stage zero in that lower part of the reach. This is the private land boundary. And so initially it was like, okay, we would do it right to there, but they are realistic people, so that only lasted a second or two, and then they came up with this modified design in which the restoration tapers and creates a
So
level of safety before the project.
you're calling this a design, but that looks like the current river channel. How, explain what it is to us.
Yeah, so for them, it's a visual representation of where the cut and fill areas would be, just based on the colors. And so when they see the purple, which is the existing channel, and especially areas of deep, darker purple, those are the places that to them suggest they should be higher in elevation than they are now. That's incision. And then the areas that are in the red or in the orange and yellow, those are areas that are higher in elevation than they would expect now, that they think of as being places they can borrow from and do cut and fill other.
But this is just a relative elevation model of current conditions. It's not a future surface.
Correct, yes, yeah, it's the cut fill plan. In a certain way.
Any other questions? Or any questions from our virtual attendees?
There need to be questions because we've never ended sponsor presentation days 2 minutes early.
Let's do it.
I'll give you.
We have a day and a half of
Well,
presentation.
you have the flat basalt area that you're gonna put logs on. How do you anchor them so they don't just wash off the basalt?
Yeah, so neither of these projects, okay. The first project is not planning to do any anchoring in the West Fork Teanaway. That's why it's considered replenishment rather than placement. In this case, if you're using a stage zero approach, you also don't anchor because you have covered up that bedrock with a lot of loose alluvium and the wood is incorporated into it. So you're no longer placing wood right on the bedrock. The in-between project phase that I mentioned is not ready for implementation funding. It's in design right now. But there may be an element of needing to anchor on the bedrock in that project where we've just hired on engineers for that. And part of what's in their scope is looking at whether bedrock anchoring is the technique they'll propose.
You drill holes and put bolts in or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Becca, to get the fill from the high areas to the low areas, are those areas forested now? Would you be deforesting the higher areas?
Yeah, what they've done on the Oregon projects, there'll be specific leaf trees that they work around if there are, legacy trees that they want to protect. But we don't have very many old growth trees in this area, but otherwise the trees become part of the overall fill. So they get incorporated in the gut. No, I would, okay. I can add on.
They're not providing any shading to the stream channel in their locations right now.
Of course they are, yeah, they are, but the stream channel itself will be really different let me go back.
Because historically, those are floodplains that have now had encroachment, so they're not really serving the purpose of a floodplain, but and all the habitat uplift and cooling potential and hyperbaric connection that you would have. So ultimately, they were talking about how you would have an immediate temporary increase in temperature when you take the trees down, when you open it up like that, but very quickly that would rebound and back down to your original temperature after you're getting more of the meadow development effect.
You do have a transitional space where you have wider, shallower channels with more sun on them. And so this is a site that's not quite like what anyone's done stage zero in the past. So I think those will be the kinds of questions that hopefully you guys can address with monitoring and some careful thought going in and careful evaluation as you do it.
Well, it's also preliminary, right? So the relative elevation model suggests areas to cut and fill, but that doesn't mean necessarily the prescription has to be
Right.
the whole thing. There's gray areas where you can leave variability out there.
It definitely looks like in this example, they left the big cottonwood and then took, some of the smaller material. They didn't have a lot of trees anyway in this case, but.
Any final thoughts or questions? We'll hold wrap-up thoughts for the end tomorrow, unless anyone has anything they wanna get down on in our notes or otherwise bring up today while it's on your mind.
And if not, I know some people won't be able to join us again tomorrow. If that's you, or if not, if you have extra thoughts, as you're mulling over everything that you've heard today, questions, things that you'd like to see on the site tours, please email me, at leadentity@whiteverb.org. Or within the next day or 3, and I can get those incorporated, get that feedback passed along to our sponsors.